welcome everybody, and welcome to the Digital Catapult. I found out about, well, I know about this place because I'm on the board. And little did I know when I agreed to be on the board of the Digital Catapult that they would move into offices like with this amazing view. So I'm going to have as many meetings here as I possibly can because it is just stunning. You won't see it tonight, but it's even better at night because you get the lights all over. I also used to be on the board of the British Library. And so that has a fond place in my memory. And behind that is going to be the Turing Institute. So, and this, of course, then there's going to be Google. And this is the Knowledge Quarter. And you get a most fantastic view of it here. So welcome to the Digital Catapult. Now, there's lots of things with web science in the title. This afternoon, we're focusing particularly on the work we do at the University of Southampton. So we can be unashamedly glowing about Southampton University this afternoon because it is we are hosting here the first anniversary of the launch of the Web Science Institute at the University of Southampton. And actually, before I forget, we should all be singing happy birthday to Tim Berners-Lee today. Tim Berners-Lee, it's his birthday and he's 60 today. And a big landmark in anyone's life. So we could go late. We haven't got a cake, actually, but there is an office with his name on it. So anyway, happy birthday to Tim. He's quite young, of course, actually. I would say that, wouldn't I? But I think it must be amazing. There's not many people who change the world in the way his invention has and live to see the impact and consequences of what you've done. And he's going to be around for a long time to come, and I think it must be quite hard to be the inventor of the web because he has a certain view of how this thing should be and how it should evolve, and it must be quite hard to see the powers that be and the different stakeholders trying to rip that apart in many ways. So really, we've decided to pick on the topic this afternoon, very timely. It has been timely ever since the web was invented, and in fact since the internet. But it's this tension between privacy and security in the digital world. And that's what we decided to explore this afternoon. And we've got three panels with external speakers, and then we finish with some presentations from our own homegrown PhD students in our lovely Web Science Doctoral Training Centre. I would like to point out at the end of the afternoon there is a reception. I think there's alcohol. Yes? Who's here who's organising it? I'm sure there's alcohol because I think, yeah, paid. So, no Claire. And you have a chance to look around the exhibits we've got demonstrating some of the research, and do have a look. In the brochure you've got something about the Macroscope project, which is a view onto our observatory project, and the big screen above the stairs, it doesn't actually say it, but that is where we are displaying the Macroscope, and each view is a view on some analysis of data from the World Wide Web and what we society is doing on the web. You can see a map of who's editing Wikipedia today and what they're editing it about, and analysis to all sorts of things. And it's the first time we've done it on that big rolling display screen. So you can work out what it's about if you look at the URL. But do have a look at that. There's a brochure about it in your pack. So it's my privilege to chair this afternoon's panel. We've actually only got half an hour left now, or 35 minutes, so that's absolutely fine. I've only got two people on this panel. I'll introduce them both from here, and then they can take over. So on my right, my friend and colleague, Sir David Omand, who's a previous director of GCHQ. He then, mad fool, became permanent secretary at the Home Office. Escaped, no, sorry, I think that. And is now a visiting professor at King's College, and he's come from there, from teaching there this morning. It's very kind of him. And he and I, oh, can you hold up the... We are both commissioners on the Global Commission for Internet Governance. We are both also members of the RUSI Independent Surveillance Review, so we spend a lot of time with some really interesting people talking about all this issue of the balance between privacy and security in the digital world. And then on the far right, my friend and colleague Philip Sheldrake, who is by background an engineer. He's a director of Tech UK, and he consults in this world of social, business and digital transformation. And he's going to talk more about the sort of social compact we need to build in this world and talk about the HIGH project. So I'm going to ask David to start. I'll come and sit between you. Are you going to stand or sit, David?
I'll just sit, I think.
Sit and talk to us about digital privacy and security.
Well, thanks very much, Wendy. And you owe my presence here entirely to Wendy's persuasion. I hadn't intended to come out paperless, but I have. So bear with me whilst I draw on my laptop for my notes. Wendy mentioned the work we've been doing together, both on the independent British review of surveillance and privacy, and on the commission chaired by Carl Bildt into the future of internet governance. And on the commission, one of the preoccupations we've had is the prospect of a damaging long-term erosion of trust in the absence of a broad social agreement on the norms that should apply for responsible behavior on the internet, particularly for digital privacy and security. We all want the internet to remain a global engine of social and economic progress. We're obviously concerned that it reflects cultural diversity. It's got to be open, freely available, and safe. And we will only get that if we have as wide an agreement as possible between the stakeholders on what we mean by responsible behavior on the internet. So in The Hague, to coincide with the Global Conference on Cyberspace in April, we issued a statement, which I've held up on the web, setting out what we believe should be some of the steps to build that confidence. And on the one hand, we have the rights to privacy and free speech, fundamental rights in the UN Declaration. They have to be respected. On the other hand, we have another requirement, which is that the rule of law has to be upheld in any civilized society. And these two goals, we do not believe, are mutually exclusive. Indeed, they're mutually reinforcing. And individuals and businesses must be protected from the unlawful use of the internet by cyber criminal groups, terrorists, and so on, as much and in addition to being protected from the overreach of governments and businesses that can, of course, collect and use and potentially misuse private data. And that led us to this idea of a social compact built on a shared commitment by the stakeholders to take concrete action to build trust and confidence. We felt quite strongly that the way to make progress on this was through the idea of norms of behavior, rather than a treaty-based approach where it's in the hands of governments and governments all come together in some giant treaty negotiation. It took centuries for the law of the sea to be codified. It will take centuries for the international law relating to the internet to be codified. But norms are easier, and like-minded democratic countries can all agree to adopt the same set of norms and principles. I think we are well placed in the UK to take a leading role in showing how you can do this. We've got a government now that said it will introduce new legislation. We don't know what that will be, but the opportunity is there. In one sense, this is a classic public policy dilemma where there are conflicting considerations, each one of which is legitimate in its own right. I was debating this with Bruce Schneier at the Hague conference, and he, in his book, his latest book, he described this as a search for a Nash equilibrium, which will mean something to the mathematicians who are versed in game theory. But it's essentially satisficing the different aspects of the problem, but avoiding optimizing on just one of those considerations. So one way of looking at the problem is to see three dimensions, three layers. There's the everyday use we make of the internet, and we are completely dependent on it now, of course. It has its potential for global economic and social development, and in that space, we need security for our financial transactions and our personal data, and that, of course, is the preoccupation of the civil libertarians who've argued for constraints on digital intelligence. Largely, I have to say, misunderstanding the difference between access to data in bulk and mass surveillance. They're very different, and we can debate that. But we have this everyday level where confidence in the security of the internet I regard as an economic essential for the economic health of this country and indeed of the globe. But then you have a second domain, which is law enforcement, where you have responsibility for policing the internet, tackling the child abusers and the terrorists and the cyber criminals and the proliferators and the narcotic gangs and the people traffickers. And the preoccupation of the police services has been, you can't declare a no-go area in cyberspace. There isn't one in the three dimension of the conventional world. Why should there be one in cyberspace? And so they are busy trying to police the worst excesses of the internet and make it safe for its users. For the police, access to digital communication data is the most important investigative tool they have. And then you've got a third domain, which has got a lot of attention recently, which is the domain of secret intelligence, where you have intelligence agencies with national security missions supporting the operations of armed forces, supporting diplomacy, gathering intelligence on international terrorists and dictators, and so on. And in that domain, of course, we've had agency chiefs speaking out about the damage that has been done by all these revelations about their ability to conduct their mission. Now, I think the beginning of wisdom is to realize there are conflicts between the requirements of those three levels: the everyday level, law enforcement, and secret intelligence. And you can't wish them away. But if you optimize on only one dimension, be it absolute security for personal communication, or be it absolute openness for the gathering of intelligence, and the result will be unwelcome consequences for society as a whole, and for its weaker members, I may say. So in the Commission, we haven't been arguing about trading privacy for security. That's not a very sensible way of thinking about it. We need both, and sensible amounts of both. It does mean regulating the access to data by open and clear law and robust oversight. So in the Built Commission, we've published a set of principles, obviously respecting human rights, including privacy and personal data protection. Any interference with our rights to privacy should not be arbitrary or unlawful. But there have to be some exceptions, and those have to be laid down by law. We've called for, where there is interception of information on the internet, it should be for purposes that are openly specified and laid down in law and authorized by law, including international human rights law, and consistent with well-understood principles like proportionality and necessity. Purposes such as gaining political advantage, exercising repression, getting commercial advantage for your companies are not legitimate. The law itself must be publicly accessible. Anyone who's tried to read the British legislation may have found it a tough read. Well, the legislation may be necessarily complex, but the statement that accompanies it for the ordinary public, approved by Parliament, the code of practice, doesn't have to be convoluted. It can be simple, and it should be simple. There should be oversight, there should be appropriate redress, and independent investigation where abuses are suspected. And then we talk a little bit about businesses that transmit and store data and the responsibilities they have to safeguard data from illegal intrusion, damage, or destruction. And there are all the choices which we should have over the uses which are made of the data which we place on the internet. So, in conclusion, what we're really saying is that we need to establish a set of norms of what responsible behavior by governments and by companies, and indeed by individuals, amounts to. We won't necessarily get every government on the planet to sign up to those, but we could get most civilized democratic nations to agree on them because they are principles that are pretty much universal. I won't go into detail. I encourage you to read the statement we put out. This is an area where there's no monopoly of wisdom, either in government or indeed between nation states. Passions can run high, and we've seen how they do. There's much hypocrisy, both from the commercial world and indeed from states, about what is going on. There are commercial interests that are not always made explicit. The key to making progress in this area is rationality, being straightforward. I think you'll find that if you read our paper. And just to repeat at the end, in the UK, we have a wonderful opportunity to set a world lead on how a democracy does do this, because we have been promised new legislation. There's the committee that, the inquiry that Wendy and I are sitting on for the Royal United Services Institute that the Deputy Prime Minister set up. There's Carl Bildt, Commission. We've got David Anderson QC's report coming out later this week, and we've already had substantial reports from the parliamentary committee. So there's a lot of material which even 5 years ago it would have been unthinkable would have been out there in the public domain. I will do certainly what I can, as I know Wendy will, to push for a sensible set of norms to underpin our new legislation. But I'll stop there.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to run on with Oh, I've got to use this, right. So that was a brilliant exposition of what we say in this report. You just have to type in "Toward a Social Compact" into your favourite search engine and it'll come up as a PDF. It's quite a short document and went through many iterations and I think is a very powerful statement that I hope people around the world will take heed of as they think about these things. Now, our second speaker, Philip, is going to talk to us about how we might develop this type of social compact. So, Philip, do you want to give us your ideas today?
Wendy, thanks very much for inviting me to comment on the statement this afternoon. Thanks to the Institute as well. I've got a dozen slides just to frame a perspective on the statement to see if I might shine a light on the way we might articulate the report a year from now as the Commission concludes. So this question, asked rhetorically perhaps by our Prime Minister recently, may actually sum up the issue that the Commission is grappling with. You could say it's a loaded question depending on what answer you think he might have in mind, but let's just take it as an open question at the moment. I can't help but think about McLuhan when I see a question posed like that. He said that we shape our tools and thereafter our tools shape us. And immediately I'm thinking, well, you can't roll back technology, and you definitely can't roll back mathematics. So we have to live with what we have and appreciate that future innovation is upon us. And of course, Gibson also then comes at it from another point, which actually that future is already with us here today. It's just unevenly distributed. And it's that uneven distribution that we find societies grappling with today from a security and privacy point of view. You could imagine a pre-digital world, level playing field, and then we start getting some of these amazing information technologies that governments around the world can now use to monitor the bad guys. And so they make use of the unevenness of that technology distribution because only the big organizations have the costly expertise and the capex budgets to invest in that technology. And we shoot up that curve top right. There's a power asymmetry and the technology unevenness. But those technologies eventually even out. Moore's law takes place, and eventually we're all carrying around in our pockets that which used to take up many rooms in government agency. So we find ourselves, if you like, on that part of the curve, heading back down to zero asymmetry. The bad guys now have an equivalent capability to the guys we look to look after us. And I think the Prime Minister, by asking that question, is saying, hey, can we prop that up a little bit? Can we move back up that curve a little bit? Can we just reverse it somehow? I started to make a list of all the reasons why the answer to that question is no, we can't prop it up. And then, as my efforts were dribbling off somewhere, I found that Cory Doctorow had already done the job for me. If we wish to intercept any communication, then we have to take into account that it will be easy for criminals, voyeurs, and foreign spies to intercept it also. It's a lovely metaphor for that. If you leave your key under the mat, for your mum to let herself in, anyone else can look for that key and let themselves in as well. I won't read this verbatim, but he does continue on this slide as well. We're going to need 100% deep packet inspection. We're going to need existing walled gardens to close down and close off all that secure software. Not only that, but all those computer operating systems that aren't closed must become closed in order to only be licensed to run state-approved software. And of course, given that computers are the size of your thumbnail now, you've got to have incredible border control as well. I mean, if we can't stop 80-kilogram humans coming in, try stopping an 80-gram device. This is actually painting a vista of a society that I thought we were trying to avoid. So that's why we can't prop it up, that's why we can't go back up the curve, but of course it would be a cop-out then to say thank you very much and sit down. So I've been grappling with how we might answer this question, and I lighted on the work of Professor Steve Mann. So he has made the study of surveillance his academic life's work. In fact, he invented the neologism surveillance, watching the watchers. And he contends that it's inevitable that we'll move from a surveillance society to a valence society, where we're all watching each other. Make of that what you will, but that's kind of where we are. We used to have one CCTV camera on the street. Now a car will have one in each corner very shortly. But Sir and Sue is very parent-child. And I'm very interested in society as adult-adult relationships. And so Professor Mann has the idea of covalence, and I've complemented that with the idea of sociovalence. So covalence has society at large as its domain. It's trying to get an equivalence of valence capability. It's in many ways trying to cancel out the privacy concerns. And he's not hidden it. His agenda is to get rid of the disempowering nature of surveillance. Sociovalence has a closer to home domain. It's one's immediate socios, your friends, colleagues, and maybe their friends and family and colleagues as well. It's about striving for value equivalence, mutual value creation as a society, allowing people to negotiate data exchange with others based on their own settings of their privacy parameters. And ultimately, it has self-organization at its heart. It becomes part of you when we no longer think about analog and digital as different things. It represents you. And that's why it was exciting to read the statement from the Commission and to read its aspirations that we need to form a social compact. It says, the social compact will contribute to a new kind of collaborative privacy and security. Every part of the internet ecosystem affects every other part. What's interesting about that first sentence, actually, is you can reverse the cause and effect and it still reads very well. If we develop a new kind of collaborative privacy and security, it will enable the social compact. And that's a powerful proposition, particularly as I contend we don't need to invent any new technology. There's no further eureka moment required. We just have to use today's open technologies to do so. The statement reads that the compact is about ensuring that a framework exists where each actor has the responsibility to act not only in their own interests, but also in the interest of the ecosystem as a whole. And I think it's absolutely right to focus on each and every one of us in this room, each and every one of the 500 million people in the EU, each and every one of the 7 billion of us around the world. Because our society and this internet thing we've inherited are both complex adaptive systems. Aristotle used to say that if there's an answer, nature's probably already worked it out. Well, I see some of nature reflected in this. Because the health and the resilience of a living system requires that each and every one of us, as an actor in that system, can operate intelligently. And if we have poor privacy and poor security, you undermine the intelligence, you undermine the potential vibrancy and health of that society. So the HIDE project, where HI stands for the human interface, it's about moving the user interface away from the machines, where it resides for pre-digital atavistic reasons, to the entities in this thing that actually count, which is the humans. So that the machines that proxy for the organisations deign to adapt to each and every one of us, rather than insist that we adapt to them. So that it inculcates an empowerment at an individual level, and at a societal level, we allow collective intelligence to emerge. Thank you.
Time to warm you up now. They're a bit flat at the moment, aren't they? I don't know if is there a mic? Oh yeah, you've got one. Okay, right. This is very profound stuff. Someone must have some thoughts on it.
I want me to disagree with what I've just heard. Would that
yes.
get a debate going? I mean, I agree very much with the back half of what you were saying. The front half could be summed up as saying, because you can't do everything, you should be allowed to do nothing. In other words, the hysteresis loop that you drew, it moves around. It's certainly not stable. There's a big difference between saying, in the interests of maintaining high confidence in the integrity of the internet, we have a lot of strong encryption end-to-end. That rules out certain kinds of intelligence gathering, fine. It doesn't rule out all kinds of intelligence gathering. The intelligence agencies and the police service are not going to give up. They will find other ways. And of course, people make mistakes. Even with end-to-end encryption, they will make mistakes. So because you can't do everything doesn't mean that we shouldn't give, with due legal authority, say the police service, the right to seek evidence. So at the moment, the telecoms companies have a legal obligation in this country, and they deliver intercept or communication data when there's a lawful warrant signed and delivered to them. The over-the-top services don't do that.
No.
In principle, there's no reason why they shouldn't. And it wouldn't necessarily mean everything has to be accessed by government or held by government. And therefore, the way I'm looking at this is much more to do with you get the right legal framework. If it means, technology means you can't get what you're looking for, well, I mean, that's the story of life, isn't it? There's no guarantee today that a police inquiry will turn up the evidence they're looking for. But I wouldn't pass a law saying that the police are not allowed to seek. And that's what I find very difficult to accept, is the idea that the internet has a different set of rules from the three-dimensional space.
I think that's an important clarification, so I'm glad you've raised it. As for that hysteresis loop, of course, there's technology all the way around that loop at any one point. The part that I was saying is descending at the moment is fundamental to the encryption capability that we all have almost freely now with very little training and education. We can all encrypt our communications, at least everybody in this room, given an hour and a how-to page, would probably be able to get unbreakable encryption in place. I'm not saying that those who are looking after society's best interests shouldn't continue the technology arms race, if you like, no doubt about that, nor should we remove powers from the police to subpoena third parties as and when they need to do so.
Then the test case comes when you have identified a serious criminal or a terrorist. You've identified them, you're close enough to know the IP address that they're using. You may even be able to get some covert access to their machine. Would you then say, no, you're not allowed backdoors, you're not allowed to use the kind of technology which would be available in order to give you visibility?
I would not.
Or indeed, even more simple, put a camera, a covert camera, so you can actually watch them typing on the screen. That would be the easiest way.
And there is nothing that I said that would preclude that capability. I think it's what we can't do is talk to third-party technology providers and insist that they leave a back door open.
That's where we could have an interesting argument about what you mean by a back door.
Yeah, can we open it up a bit? We do say quite clearly in here, that's not, the government shouldn't be able to mandate that. Let's open it up. Otherwise, I can let these two carry on debating, but go on. Oh, so one over here. You got there first, okay.
I'm not sure who got in first, but if I jumped, then I apologise.
You've got the mic.
Quite so, I'm not with the microphone.
You say who you are and where you're from, just so we get to know each other.
I'm Dan Headley. I'm a technology lawyer. I work for Thomas Egger. We've heard a lot, particularly you, Sir David, talked about there being a wide degree of consensus amongst what I think you referred to as democratic countries. I would put it to you that that's all well and good, but quite a lot of the bad stuff, for want of a better phrase, isn't in those countries. It's not being operated from those countries. It's often not hosted in those countries. How do you then get at it?
Very good question. One of the things we have been very conscious of in the Built Commission is this is an international. The internet is not a national space. One of the ways you tackle that is through going into the intelligence space. So if you've got a criminal gang somewhere in, I won't pick a country because I'll only offend the country, but somewhere which would not respect a mutual legal assistance treaty request, well, you want to have a go at that gang, don't you? You want to find out who they are. You want to find out why are they mounting this major attack against one of the banks in Canary Wharf. You want to disrupt that attack if you possibly can. You want to study the vector of attack, study the particular flaws they may have discovered in the software that allows them to mount that attack and get those flaws fixed. So to do that, you've actually got to get into what I call the intelligence space. And that's, of course, why we have the sort of capability we've got down at GCHQ. We're some way away from having, if you like, mutual legal assistance framework that would solve that for some of the countries that we're talking about. But that doesn't mean to say that within, say, between ourselves and our European partners and ourselves in the United States, we shouldn't have a pretty swept up, rapid mutual legal assistance respect of
I
warrants.
can't help but point out what's happened with FIFA at the moment, and that's a very international operation, not in this space particularly, but I'm sure some of the stuff they've done has been
But they have
online.
actually managed to nail it.
Absolutely. So it's not beyond the wit of those if you want to do it, but another whole issue. Yes, go ahead.
Hello, hello, Bridget Wessels from University of Sheffield. I was particularly interested in the notion of norms. It's sort of a catch-all, and I just wondered how we might start to develop a framework for fostering digital norms. Is it through education? Where we think the police service sits, particularly in the UK, it's policing by consent. How would that normative, what would those norms look like in the digital sphere? And I just wondered if you'd done any work on that at all.
Yes, there's some clues in the paper we put out from the Built Commission. I've actually written a research paper, which you'll also find online, in which I go into rather more detail what I think, it's only my view, I think those norms should look like. I'm heavily influenced by the just war approach to international humanitarian law. You know, we have tamed some of the worst excesses of state violence by codifying in international humanitarian law a number of principles: proportionality, necessity, lawful purpose, avoidance of collateral damage, so that the innocents are not swept up. None of these can be guaranteed, but they provide quite a strong, in this internet world, quite a strong series of principles which need to apply. Proportionality, for example, would rule out as being unlawful mass surveillance if conducted in the UK. And that's a very clear application of that norm, which is directly translated into law, so that law does require proportionality. And any judge looking at it would be able to see mass surveillance and recognize it when they saw it.
Unlike in some other countries.
Well, other countries don't necessarily have the same structure.
Norms is definitely not my area.
Okay. There's Faith here, and there's a lady at the back, and then we'll have to, I've seen Nigel arrive, so we'll have to move on to the, oh, John, did you want to say something? All right, so we'll take the three. Nigel is here, isn't he? I've seen him through there. Can someone, yeah. Faith. I'll take these three comments and then give you to a closing comment.
It's partly following on from that and also coming back to some of the stuff that was being said about sort of the culture and the community. Because I think one of the interesting things you see when you look at the online areas in that communities do develop cultural norms. It's just the cultural norms that you see developing within the communities and not necessarily the ones that we want them to have or the ones that we want them to agree with. And they tend to be very different from each other. So the way you are expected to behave in some areas of the internet will be different from the ways that you're expected to behave in others. So, you were talking about, finding the norms for the area, looking at people coming together with a shared set of expected reasonable behaviours and even a shared set of expected unreasonable behaviours. But when we're looking at, what's sort of currently happened, communities come together because that's what they do. And, social studies says there is a limit on the size of the community that you will get, and then they break apart again. So how do you think we will get this all coming together?
We'll take three comments together and then ask the panellists to wind up. There's a lady at the back there, and then there's a John McCanney over there, I can see. Tell us who you are.
Thanks. Anne Alexander from Cambridge. I had a comment relating to the framing of the issue between the heart of kind of good governance, both in the internet sense and in the broader sense, is in democratic countries, and the bad guys are out there in other countries that we don't want to name. But I think actually if you look a little more closely though at, for example, the UK's exports in surveillance technology, then you find actually there's some more uncomfortable relationships there with, for example, groups like the Gamma Group, which creates advanced spyware, which is used by countries, has been used by Syria, I believe, it's definitely used by Bahrain in order to spy on activists and opposition figures, yet is also sponsoring the UK's Government Security and Policing Expo, or did so last year. So, I mean, I would just be interested if the panelists could perhaps comment on those kinds of more uncomfortable relationships between surveillance for doing bad things and surveillance for doing good things.
In the interest of time, we'll take one from John, and then you just give us your final thoughts on any of these points or others.
Okay, thanks. John McCanny from Queen's University Belfast. Just to pick up on Sir David's comments about principles, a lot of major ICT companies make their money by digitizing or by monetizing digital information. So I just was kind of curious as to whether the set of principles that might the public might perceive as being appropriate would be the same set of principles as the companies who are making considerable amounts of money on it might also find appropriate, and where's the balance in that? Right,
so final comments from our panellists. Philip.
Do you know, those three questions are so your domain. From my perspective, I'm a chartered engineer, not a sociologist, not a politician. The way I look at society is as a complex, adaptive system. And what I'm seeing increasingly is that authoritarian, top-down, command and control approaches to society are at the breaking point. They no longer work. And actually, in trying to prop them up, we're propping up the very systems that we're supposed to be fighting. So when you move the interface from the machine to the individual, the interface is actually the locus of your data and information. It's the nexus of your privacy parameters. It's your access, and therefore your area of accessibility to the web, to participate in what it means to be a member of society in the 21st century, to help shape and respond emergently to some of the questions that are being asked this afternoon. So I put my faith in nature. I put my faith in trying to make sure that the architecture can return to its original vision of being open, accessible, and valuable for everyone.
I certainly share the support for those words. What the Internet Governance Commission is struggling with, though, is how do you actually ensure that? And that we don't have private gardens being set up. We don't find that there's balkanization that is genuinely open, that for commercial reasons we don't discover that the open approach to software that we might hope is actually, it's moved back to a previous era. And I don't think there's a simple answer to that. You can't ensure it. But if we can create the right kind of conditions, we will find there is a sort of evolutionary move, because we have sold ourselves to the internet. It has to work. And very soon it will be for almost everyone on the globe. It has to be, as you describe it. So there'll be some pretty powerful reasons why people will have to swallow hard and say, no, we will sign up to some of this. On exports, very good question, but I don't see any difference whatever from the problems that you get with exports of, say, non-lethal military equipment. It's exactly the same problem. You have friendly countries, sovereign wealth funds that invested heavily in this country and its technical future. The governments want to import equipment from the United Kingdom. It's a democratic decision for the UK where we set the bar on export control regimes as to whether we do or do not permit those exports. That's no different for cyber monitoring equipment as it is for non-lethal riot control equipment, and they can both be misused. So I think that is a slightly separate issue. Finally, on principles for the private sector, quite a lot of these, I think, transparency. If you're the consumer, do you actually know what is going on? Lawful purpose, consent. In the case of the state, use of interception, you can't have individual consent, but you can have democratic consent. You can have it debated in Parliament. In the case of the private sector's use of data, I want some individual say, thank you very much, in what uses are made of my data.
Can I stop you there? Because that is a brilliant point to finish on, because I think it leads in very well to our next panel. Can we thank David and Philip very much for kicking us off this afternoon?